Much, Acting Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise and talk on the Public Health and Wellbeing Bill, which, as previous speakers have reflected on, relates to the extension of the state of emergency powers. And, Acting Speaker, I note that some speakers on the other side, not all, some speakers have suggested that we are opposed to an extension to the state of emergency. Of course, that is not true. What we are opposed to is the handing over of absolute power for 9 months for the remainder of this year. And the reason, Speaker, is I believe, as does our side of politics believe, that these are decisions that should be made on a month-by-month basis, discussed, debated, considered and then approved by both Houses of Parliament. This would allow members in the chamber to bring down their thoughts, their views, their perceptions, their feedback from constituents on how this impacts on our communities. So whilst the health outcomes always have to be number one in these scenarios, they are not the only circumstances that need to be considered. And I'd like to get into some of the detail around that. Many hundreds of emails this week to my office, and I'm sure it's to all members of Parliament, have requested that absolute power does not be handed over for this length of time. And a lot of the issues raised relate to how these powers have been used of relatively recent times, and I want to touch on some of them for a few moments. Statewide lockdowns with no notice, or when I say no notice, notice of a matter of hours, have massive, massive implications that I'm not sure are completely understood. The member for Tarneit who spoke before me, she mentioned that she and her partner were caught up in interstate and having to travel back to Victoria. What was the case in my electorate was we had people lined up at the border for 7 hours with kids in cars till 3 in the morning, needing to go to the toilet, no food, trying to get home, cancelled accommodation. Now, these were East Gippsland people holidaying in locations like Merimbula, Pambula, Eden, Bermagui, Bega, just over the border. They then found out the following day they didn't have to come home because the border bubble wasn't mentioned by the acting Premier in her media conference. The borders closing the next day after everyone had come home after this horrible experience. The government came out and said, the border bubble still exists. Those people didn't have to come home. They'd cancelled their holidays at cost, come home only to find out. The rushed nature of this decision caused the acting Premier at that time to forget all about this critical piece of information. Let me provide a couple of examples from the latest decision. Made on a Friday, the bushfire-ravaged community of Buchan has one of its probably 2 major events for the year, the Canai Creek Bush Races, 1,000 people going. Catering organised, the town booked out, the town looking for a great economic drink after the trauma of the fires and then COVID. Less than 24 hours notice, it's not on. Valentine's Day weekend, the hotels that were booked out in our region, people coming away, the pubs. I was talking to one publican. It's not funny, Acting Speaker, it's quite serious actually, the financial implications, but one publican in my electorate was having the food for that weekend delivered on the Friday morning, and then Friday afternoon was told we're going into lockdown. With 24 hours notice prior, those deliveries into our region didn't have to take place. Massive, massive cost to these businesses. We simply need more notice. Businesses and communities in my electorate want to know when they're 300 to 500 kilometres away from the nearest case, why they have to be closed down. Not only smashed the business already hard hit by fires and COVID, but it caused the 3rd highest day of calls into Lifeline in its 60-year history. But the point I want to make is that these snap lockdowns, they don't prevent people from travelling. The idea behind this philosophy is we'll tell people at the last minute to stop people travelling. The member for Gippsland South just walked into the chamber, and he'll back up the fact that at 7 o'clock on Friday night we had a non-stop trail of caravans, boat trailers, camper trailers, all streaming into our area. These snap lockdowns don't stop people from travelling. They actually make people travel more hastily, and they cause massive, massive economic damage to the region. So it defeats the purpose of saying, oh, we're going to by midnight tonight, because they jump in their cars and they go. And all you're doing with this late notice is destroying businesses. These are the matters that we need to be able to come down here as country MPs when we're talking about the extension of state of emergency and those rules and regulations that will sit under that. These are the arguments we need to be able to bring down into this parliament and say, can you please consider these implications on our electorates? Because they are absolutely massive.
Yep.
That's why we shouldn't be handing over state of emergency powers for 9 months for these snap decisions to be made that disadvantage our businesses and our communities. We need to be able to debate, discuss, come up with some common sense arrangements that aren't such a disadvantage to so many people. We might not always agree, but at least it would give us the opportunity to raise these concerns in this place and represent those people who elect us to do that. At the moment, under these arrangements, we are denied that. The other point I wish to make is in relation to the details on lack of business support. It just hasn't been appropriately addressed. And an analysis that was presented to our PAYAC committee showed some really damning figures. And this was in December, but of the 20 government business support programs, 14 of the 20, 70%, couldn't provide any details of how much money they distributed to businesses. Of the 6 that were able to be reported on, less than half the promoted value of the package had been distributed. This is 6 months after these business supports are announced. So the minister walks out and says, oh, have a look at me. I'm announcing $100 million in business supports to small businesses in Victoria. Aren't I good? And then 6 months later we find out 12 or 15 million out of that 100 million has been allocated. That is extraordinarily misleading. If we're going to announce $100 million in small business supports, we cannot have ministers setting the criteria so narrow that so many businesses are limited in relation to being a successful applicant. We need to have more flexibility. And then on top of that shocking misrepresentation of the facts, the Bairnsdale RSL sub-branch gets a letter this week that's been shut down for 6 months. We wrongly gave you $15,000. Can you pay back the $15,000 to us? And you've got 9 days to do it, or we'll be taking action. A government stuff-up, wrongly paid a business in financial crisis, 9 days to give it back. Not even the offer of a repayment plan or generous terms. It is just appalling. The criteria is too strict on these business supports. The government espouses the fact that it has supported so many businesses in this state. But in reality, when we look at the amount of small businesses we have in this state, a small percentage have only been supported. It's appalling. Now, this shortfall needs to be addressed. Of the last week, when we thought we were through this, after the fires, the COVID lockdown we've come out the other side, and then on the back of having under 20 cases, 300 to 500 kilometres away from our businesses, they're plunged into lockdown again. It's time that this government came out and announced some real and proper business supports and supported the fact that they should not have a 9-month free reign of stuff-ups like we've had for the last however many months that this process has been in place. And we debate this every month. Bring forth the views of our constituents, bring forth the impacts on our communities, and have that debate and discussion in here so that all those elements are properly considered.